Well, James, I'd like to take some quotes of your book, The Music of John Cage. First of all, you said John Cage was a composer. What do you make such a statement?
Well, and I think as I say in the book, it seemed like a very silly thing to have to say, but it was very necessary at the time, and I think still today, because people say, oh, well, John Cage was really more of a philosopher than a composer, or he was more important for his writing than for his music, and I totally reject that. He was a composer. He spent his entire life devoted to music and to writing music. And so when I was writing the book, I knew I needed to have a big opening, and I wanted to have a very strong statement, and I spent a lot of time thinking about that first statement, that first sentence, yes, to say John Cage was a composer. And then, of course, the whole book is about what he did as a composer, how he made his music.
Okay, another one. You said also for the Times editors, as for so many others, the problem with treating Cage as a composer is clearly a problem with his work after 1951. What happened before and after 51?
So before 1951, he was writing, he was still writing new music. He was writing for new instruments. He was writing percussion music, and he had invented the prepared piano, you know, the piano with objects inserted. But it was still expressive music. It was still within a certain tradition in the West and in America, you know, similar to Henry Cowell or composers like that. But in 1951, he discovered chants as a way of composing his music, using chants to determine how things would operate within the systems of his music. And as soon as he embraced chants and this kind of silence of non-intention, of sounds that are not intended, that are not expressive, not coming from his ego or his self, this was something that people just simply couldn't accept. They're like, well, if he's writing pieces using chants, then it doesn't really matter, or he couldn't be saying anything that was valuable, all this sort of thing, because people simply didn't understand it. And I think that's where it's hard for people to understand Cage as a composer.
You will lecture here about 433. Why do you choose this subject for your lecture?
So I'll correct you, Pablo. So I'm not talking about 433. I'm talking about Cage's silent pieces. So
yes.
There's actually
there are many
multiple.
Others.
Yes, there's multiple. So I'll talk about 4 different pieces that are all silent. I had a very difficult time with the piece at first, of trying to figure how it fit with the rest of Cage's compositions. But now it's 20 years later, and I'm making up for lost time, and I'm talking about it a lot. And the more I look at this conception of silence and why he would write this piece from a spiritual point of view and from a historical point of view of how he arrived at that point and how he progressed past that, I'm finding it more and more interesting. And so fortunately, I was invited to come here to Buenos Aires right when I was in the middle of thinking about this piece a lot, so I decided to speak about it here.
In a few words, what are the differences between these silent pieces?
Between the 4 silent pieces. So in 1948, he proposes a piece called Silent Prayer, which would be totally silent, 4.5 minutes long, and he was going to sell it to the Muzak company in the United States, you know, that does the music in the elevators and things like that. But this is a very striking historical fact, because in 1948, what would a silent piece mean for John Cage in 1948? It raises a lot of questions. I don't have answers for all of them. But he proposes that in 1948. In 1952, he composes 4 minutes and 33 seconds, the piece we all, you know very well. But I think he may have had concerns about that piece, and you find that he kind of put a little distance between himself and that piece over the years. In 1962, he writes a new version of 4 minutes and 33 seconds, which he calls 0 minutes and 0 seconds, because there's no measurement of time. And this I see as a version that gets back to the original idea of a sort of non-material piece. And then finally, this piece 1-3, which he composes in 1989, is his last silent piece. which is a very beautiful piece, which has no performer, and there's sort of nothing there but empty space. It's very beautiful. And I'll talk a little about that too.